The October morning at Buckingham Palace carried the crisp edge of autumn, with golden leaves scattered across the pristine grounds, and a thin mist hanging in the air that made everything look dreamlike. Captain Edward Harrington stood at attention. Outside the palace's main entrance, his red tunic immaculate and his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. At 28, he was one of the youngest officers ever assigned to the elite Queen's Guard. Having earned his position through exceptional service in Afghanistan and an unblemished record of ceremonial duties, Edward's assignment today was routine but important. He would be part of the Honor Guard, welcoming a small American diplomatic delegation led by Senator Vance of Ohio. The visit had been arranged quickly. Part of ongoing discussions about trade relationships and military cooperation between the United States and the United Kingdom. Edward had read the briefing materials carefully, noting that Senator Vance was known for his direct speaking style and strong opinions about military service and national identity. The delegation was scheduled to arrive at 10:30 for a brief ceremonial welcome, followed by meetings with British officials inside the palace. Edward's role was straightforward: stand at attention, maintain perfect military bearing, and represent the finest traditions of the British Armed Forces. He had performed similar duties dozens of times for visiting dignitaries from around the world, and he approached each assignment with the same level of professional dedication. As Edward waited, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this prestigious position. Growing up in a working-class family in Manchester, he had never imagined he would one day stand guard at Buckingham Palace. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse, and military service had seemed like his best opportunity for education and advancement. He had enlisted at 18, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and had distinguished himself through both his combat performance and his leadership abilities. The transition from active combat duty to ceremonial service had been challenging at first. After the intensity and constant vigilance required in Afghanistan, standing motionless for hours while tourists took photographs had seemed almost trivial. But Edward had gradually come to understand the deeper significance of his role. He wasn't just a tourist attraction. He was a living symbol of British military tradition, discipline, and service. His fellow guards began taking their positions as the arrival time approached. Sergeant Robert Collins, a veteran with 15 years of service, positioned himself. At Edward's right, Collins had served in Iraq, Bosnia, and numerous peacekeeping missions, and his weathered face carried the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the world and understood his place in it. To Edward's left stood Corporal Daniel Hughes, whose family had a 4-generation tradition of military service dating back to World War I. The morning had been peaceful so far, with only a modest number of tourists gathering to watch the changing of the guard and take photographs. A few early visitors had asked respectful questions about the guard's duties and the history of their uniforms, interactions that Edward always handled with polite professionalism. He enjoyed these brief educational moments, helping people understand the traditions they were witnessing. At exactly 10:25, the security detail appeared, followed by several black diplomatic vehicles. Edward could see movement inside the cars as the American delegation prepared to exit. Protocol required that he remain perfectly still during the arrival, but he was naturally curious about the visitors he would be honoring with his presence. Senator Vance emerged from the lead vehicle, immediately recognizable from the briefing photographs Edward had studied. The senator was a tall man in his early 40s, wearing a well-tailored dark suit and carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to public attention. He was accompanied by 2 senior staff members and a small security detail, all moving with the efficient purpose that characterized high-level political visits. The initial moments of the arrival proceeded exactly according to protocol. The British diplomatic escort made introductions, security personnel coordinated positioning, and photographers captured the standard arrival shots. Edward maintained his ceremonial stance, aware that his presence and that of his fellow guards provided the formal military context that gave weight and significance to the diplomatic proceedings. But as the group moved toward the palace entrance, Edward noticed that Senator Vance had paused and was looking directly at him and his fellow guards. There was something in the senator's expression that Edward couldn't quite read, not the usual tourist curiosity or respectful acknowledgement that most visitors showed, but something more critical and evaluative. "Impressive display, Senator." Vance commented loudly enough for everyone to hear, though his tone carried an undertone that made Edward slightly uneasy. "Very traditional, very ... ceremonial." The way he emphasized the last word suggested it wasn't entirely a compliment. Edward kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, as protocol demanded, but he was acutely aware of being scrutinized in a way that felt different from normal. Diplomatic courtesy. The senator's staff seemed to sense something in his tone as well. Of his aides moved closer and said something quietly that Edward couldn't hear. Senator Vance waved him off dismissively. No, it's fine. I'm just observing." This is exactly what I expected. All ceremony, all tradition, all show.
Edward
Felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his training kept his expression neutral. He had encountered criticism of ceremonial duties before, usually from people who didn't understand the discipline and skill required to perform them properly. But there was something more personal in Senator Vance's comments, something that suggested he was building toward a larger point. The British diplomatic escort, sensing potential tension, attempted to guide the group toward the palace entrance more quickly. "Senator, if we could proceed inside, the Prime Minister's representative is waiting to begin your meetings," said Ambassador Patricia Thornton, her voice carrying the smooth professionalism of a career diplomat who had navigated countless delicate situations. But Senator Vance wasn't ready to move on. He had stopped directly in front of Edward now, close enough that Edward could smell his expensive cologne and see the details of his perfectly knotted tie. The senator was studying Edward's uniform, his bearing, and his ceremonial sword with the intense focus of someone making a judgment. "You know," Senator Vance said, his voice now clearly audible to everyone present, "in America, we believe that military service should be about more than playing dress-up for tourists." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Edward felt the attention of everyone present focusing on this unexpected confrontation. Edward's training had prepared him for many situations, but not for a direct provocation from a visiting dignitary during a formal diplomatic event. Protocol demanded that he remain silent and motionless, but every instinct he had developed during his combat service was telling him that something significant was about to happen. The senator stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that was meant to be heard only by Edward, but was still audible to those nearby. "I've seen real soldiers, son. Men who've bled for their country and earned their uniforms through sacrifice." He gestured dismissively at Edward's ceremonial regalia. This is just pageantry." In that moment, Edward realized that this wasn't just an impromptu criticism of ceremonial duties. This was a deliberate provocation, perhaps designed to test his reaction or to make a broader point about military service and national priorities. The senator was waiting for a response, and everyone present seemed to understand that whatever happened next would go far beyond the usual. Diplomatic pleasantries. Edward's mind raced through his options, his training warring with his growing anger at the unfair characterization of his service and that of his fellow guards. The next few moments would determine not just how this diplomatic visit proceeded, but how he chose to represent everything he stood for as a soldier and as a man. The tension in the palace courtyard was palpable as Senator Vance stepped even closer to Captain Edward Harrington, his eyes fixed on the young guard's face with an intensity that made the gathered diplomats shift uncomfortably. Edward could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy ceremonial uniform, but his expression remained perfectly neutral. Years of military training keeping his emotions in check despite the unprecedented nature of this confrontation. "I'm talking to you, soldier," Senator Vance said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to demanding attention and receiving immediate responses. Or maybe soldier isn't the right word? What do you call someone who's never seen real combat, never faced real danger, never had to make life or death decisions for his country? The senator's words were carefully chosen. Designed to provoke a reaction that would prove whatever point he was trying to make, Ambassador Thornton moved closer, her diplomatic instincts screaming that this situation needed immediate de-escalation. Senator Vance, perhaps we should continue this discussion inside, she suggested, her voice carefully modulated to convey urgency without appearing panicked. I'm sure Captain Harrington would be happy to answer any questions about the Queen's guard duties during a more appropriate forum. But Senator Vance wasn't interested in diplomatic courtesy. He had clearly come to this visit with an agenda that went beyond the official meetings scheduled for the morning. No, Ambassador, I think this is exactly the right time and place for it, this conversation. The American people deserve to know what real military service looks like, not this. He gestured dismissively at Edward's uniform, costume party. Edward's fellow guards remained at attention, but he could sense their growing tension. Sergeant Collins had served in 3 combat zones and had earned a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions under fire. Corporal Hughes had lost 2 fingers to an IED in Afghanistan, but had returned to service as soon as he was medically cleared, the suggestion that their service was somehow less legitimate than civilian politicians. Understanding of military duty was deeply offensive to all of them. You want to know what I see when I look at you? Senator Vance continued, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to his theme. I see a young man playing soldier, wearing a uniform that real warriors earned through blood and sacrifice. I see someone who's confused ceremony with service, tradition with duty. He paused, looking around at the ornate palace surroundings, as if they proved his point. This isn't military service, it's theater. The gathered crowd of tourists and staff had grown larger, drawn by the obvious tension and raised voices. Several people were recording the confrontation on their phones, though palace security was beginning to discourage this. Edward was acutely aware that whatever happened next would likely be broadcast around the world within hours, representing not just himself, but the entire British military establishment. Senator Vance seemed to be building toward a climactic statement, his body language becoming more aggressive as he continued his verbal assault. Real soldiers don't spend their time posing for pictures and standing around looking pretty. Real soldiers are out there protecting freedom, fighting terrorists, defending democracy. They're in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, places where the uniform actually means something. It was at this moment that Edward realized the senator's fundamental misunderstanding of both his service record and the nature of ceremonial duties. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was a politician who had never served in any military capacity, lecturing a combat veteran about the meaning of military service. Edward's 2 tours in Afghanistan, his Bronze Star for valor, and his Purple Heart seemed irrelevant to someone who had apparently decided that ceremonial duties invalidated all previous service. The senator took one final step closer, now standing close enough that Edward could see the details of his facial expression. You know what the real tragedy is here? Vance said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone but was still audible to everyone nearby. Young men like you, wasting their potential on meaningless pageantry when they could be doing something that actually matters for their country. And then came the moment that would be replayed countless times in the media coverage that followed. Senator Vance looked directly into Edward's eyes and said with unmistakable contempt, "You don't deserve that uniform." The words hung in the air like a physical blow, and Edward felt something inside him shift from professional restraint to barely controlled anger. Ambassador Thornton gasped audibly, understanding immediately that the situation had crossed a line. From diplomatic awkwardness into international incident territory, the British officials present looked shocked and offended, while the American staff members appeared mortified by their principal's behavior. Security personnel from both countries began moving closer, uncertain about how to handle a confrontation. Between a visiting senator and a ceremonial guard, Edward's mind raced through his training and his options. Military protocol was clear about maintaining respect for visiting dignitaries, but it was also clear about defending the honor of the service and fellow soldiers. His personal honor was being questioned in front of an international audience, and his response would reflect not just on himself, but on every guard who had ever worn the uniform. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how a young British soldier would respond to such a direct and personal attack from a prominent American politician. Cameras continued recording, diplomatic careers hung in, the balance. And the ancient traditions of military courtesy faced a modern test of character and restraint. Senator Vance stood with his arms crossed, apparently confident that he had made his point and that the young guard would either remain silent in defeat or react in a way that would prove his allegations about the superficial nature of ceremonial service. He seemed completely unaware that he was about to discover just how wrong his assumptions were. Edward took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his uniform, the significance of his position, and the responsibility he carried for representing something larger than himself. When he finally spoke, his voice would carry the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to wear his uniform through service that went far beyond ceremony. Captain Edward Harrington's response, when it came, was delivered in the calm, measured tone of a professional soldier who had learned to control his emotions under the most extreme circumstances. He did not break his ceremonial stance, did not raise his voice, and did not show any of the anger that was burning inside him. Instead, he looked directly into Senator Vance's eyes and spoke with the quiet dignity that comes from absolute confidence. In one's own worth, Senator Vance, Edward began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. I appreciate your concern about military service and the proper use of uniforms. As someone who has clearly given considerable thought to these matters, you might be interested to know that this uniform you see as merely ceremonial has actually been worn in combat zones around the world. The senator's confident expression faltered slightly, but Edward continued without pause. The Queen's Guard isn't just a tourist attraction, sir. We are active-duty soldiers, drawn from the most elite regiments in the British Army. Before I was assigned to ceremonial duties, I served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards. During my second deployment, my unit was responsible for training Afghan National Army soldiers and conducting counterinsurgency operations in Helmand Province. A murmur went through the gathered crowd as people began to understand that this wasn't the reaction Senator Vance had been expecting. Ambassador Thornton's face showed relief mixed with pride, while the British officials present began to smile. Slightly, the American staff members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Realizing that their principal had badly miscalculated the nature of this confrontation, Edward's voice remained steady and professional. But there was steel beneath the courtesy. In March of 2019, my squad was conducting a patrol in a village outside Lashkar Gah when we came under heavy fire from Taliban insurgents. 3 of my men were wounded in the initial attack, and we were pinned down for over 6 hours before reinforcements could reach us. I spent those 6 hours keeping my soldiers alive, coordinating medical evacuation, and returning fire against an enemy that outnumbered us 3-1. Senator Vance's face had grown noticeably paler, but Edward wasn't finished. For those actions, I was awarded the Bronze Star for valor and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. But more importantly, all 3 of my wounded soldiers survived and eventually returned to their families. That, Senator, is what earned me the right to wear this uniform, not the ceremony you see today, but the service that came before it. The courtyard had fallen completely silent, except for the sound of Edward's voice and the distant traffic of London beyond the palace walls. Even the tourists who had initially been drawn by the spectacle of a confrontation were now listening with respect to what had become a powerful statement about the nature of military service and sacrifice. The gentleman to my right, Sergeant Collins, earned his uniform during 15 years of service that included tours in Iraq, Bosnia, and Sierra Leone. He has been awarded the Military Cross for gallantry and has trained hundreds of young soldiers, who went on to serve with distinction in combat zones around the world. The corporal to my left lost 2 fingers to an improvised explosive device while serving in Afghanistan, but requested to return to active duty as soon as he was medically cleared. Edward paused, allowing the weight of these facts to settle over the gathering. We are not actors, Senator. We're soldiers who have earned the privilege of representing our regiment, our country, through both combat service and ceremonial duties. The uniform we wear today is the same uniform we wore while serving alongside American forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, fighting the same enemies, sharing the same risks, and pursuing the same goals of freedom and security. The senator's initial confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that he had made a serious miscalculation. The media representatives present were frantically taking notes, understanding that they were witnessing something that would dominate news cycles on both sides of the Atlantic. The casual dismissal of ceremonial military service had backfired spectacularly. But Edward wasn't speaking out of anger or a desire for revenge. His response came from a deeper place, a genuine desire to educate someone who had clearly misunderstood the nature of military service and the relationship between combat duties and ceremonial responsibilities. In the British military, Senator, ceremonial duties are considered an honor that is earned through exceptional service, not a consolation prize for those who haven't seen combat. We view the opportunity to represent our nation's military traditions as a continuation of our service, not a departure from it. The educational tone of Edward's response was making the confrontation more uncomfortable for Senator Vance than any angry retort would have been. He was being corrected with facts and personal experience by someone who had clearly done more research about military service than the senator had done about the guards he was criticizing. Furthermore, Edward continued, the skills required for ceremonial duties, discipline, attention to detail, physical fitness, and the ability to represent one's unit with honor are exactly the same skills that we developed and demonstrated in combat. Standing motionless for 2 hours while maintaining perfect military bearing requires the same mental toughness that allowed me to stay focused during a 6-hour firefight. Ambassador Thornton seized on Edward's reasonable tone to attempt damage control. Captain Harrington represents exactly the kind of professionalism and dedication that makes the British American military partnership so strong, she said diplomatically. I'm sure Senator Vance appreciates having the opportunity to meet such a distinguished combat veteran. But the damage was already done, and Senator Vance seemed to realize that his attempt to diminish the guards had instead elevated them while making him look uninformed and disrespectful. The gathered crowd was clearly sympathetic to Edward and his fellow guards, and the media coverage would undoubtedly focus on the senator's ignorance rather than whatever point he had been trying to make about military service, Edward maintained. His professional demeanor, but internally, he was preparing for whatever would come next. He had defended his service and that of his fellow guards with facts and dignity, but he sensed that Senator Vance wasn't ready to concede the confrontation. The next few moments would determine whether this diplomatic visit could be salvaged, or whether it would become an international embarrassment. The silence that followed Edward's dignified explanation stretched uncomfortably long, with Senator Vance visibly struggling to process the information that had completely undermined his assumptions. The confident politician who had arrived expecting to make easy points about military authenticity found himself face to face with a decorated combat veteran whose quiet professionalism made his own bluster seem petty and uninformed. Edward watched the senator's face carefully, seeing the moment when genuine realization began to replace political posturing. It was a look he had seen before, usually on the faces of new recruits when they first understood the true weight of military responsibility. Senator Vance's staff members stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or allow their principal to work through what was clearly becoming a moment of personal reckoning. Afghanistan, Senator Vance said finally, his voice much quieter than it had been moments before. He said Helmand Province. There was something different in his tone now, a shift from confrontation toward what sounded almost like curiosity. Edward nodded once, maintaining his military bearing, but allowing a slight relaxation in his rigid posture. Yes, sir. 2 tours. 18 months total. My first deployment was in 2018, my second in 2019, Edward replied, his voice remaining professional but warming slightly in response to the senator's changed demeanor. We worked primarily with the 3rd Battalion, conducting village security operations and training Afghan forces in counterinsurgency tactics. Senator Vance was quiet for a long moment, and those close enough could see that something profound was happening behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. My nephew served in Afghanistan, Marines 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. He was killed by an IED outside Marja in 2020. The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort, and the political mask he had been wearing began to slip away entirely. The courtyard fell even quieter. that was possible. Ambassador Thornton's expression softened with understanding, while the British officials present showed the kind of respectful sympathy that comes naturally to people who have lived through decades of military conflicts. Edward felt his own anger dissolving, replaced by recognition of shared loss and the complex emotions that come with discussing military service. With someone who has been touched personally by its costs, "I'm sorry for your loss, Senator," Edward said with genuine sincerity. The Marines in that area faced incredibly difficult conditions. Every soldier who served there understood the risks and chose to serve anyway. Your nephew was part of something important, and his sacrifice mattered. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of personal experience and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from having served alongside men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice. Senator Vance's aggressive posture had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost vulnerable. Jacob was his name. Jacob Vance. He was 22 years old, just graduated from Ohio State, wanted to serve his country before starting his career. He paused, struggling with emotions that were clearly still raw, despite the time that had passed. "I've been angry about military ceremonies and traditions ever since. Felt like they were disrespecting his memory somehow, making war look like a game." The honesty in this admission transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Edward understood now that the senator's attack on ceremonial duties came from a place of grief and pain rather than mere political calculation. It didn't excuse the behavior, but it explained it in a way that made a constructive response possible. "With respect," Sir Edward said gently, "I think your nephew would have understood the connection between combat service and ceremonial duties. In my experience, soldiers who have faced danger together develop a deep appreciation for the traditions that bind us as a military community. These ceremonies aren't separate from combat service, they're how we honor it." Sergeant Collins, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, took a small step forward. "Senator, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of a career soldier. "I served with several American Marine units during my deployments, some of the finest warriors I've ever had the privilege to fight alongside. Your nephew was part of a brotherhood that extends far beyond any single unit or nationality." The sergeant's words seemed to reach something deep in Senator Vance's emotional defenses. "Used to send me pictures," the senator said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Pictures of him with his squad, pictures of Afghan children. They were helping pictures of the landscape. He was so proud of what they were doing, so committed to the mission." Tears had begun to form in his eyes, though he was clearly fighting to maintain some semblance of composure. Corporal Hughes, despite having been personally attacked just minutes earlier, stepped forward with the kind of grace that comes from truly understanding suffering. "Senator, I lost my platoon leader in the same province where your nephew served. Lieutenant Morrison was like a brother to me, and when I put on this ceremonial uniform, I'm honoring his memory and the memory of every soldier who didn't make it home. This isn't theater, it's remembrance." The transformation in Senator Vance was visible to everyone present. The angry politician who had arrived ready for confrontation was being replaced by a grieving uncle who had been carrying pain and frustration for years without fully understanding its source. His staff members watched in amazement as their usually controlled and calculating leader showed genuine emotion for the first time many of them could remember. "I didn't know," Senator Vance said finally, looking around at the three guards who had just shared their most personal experiences with him. I assumed that ceremonial duties were for soldiers who hadn't seen real action. No idea that you had all served in combat zones." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but it was delivered with growing sincerity. Edward nodded understandingly. "It's a common misconception, sir. The truth is that ceremonial assignments are highly competitive and are usually given to soldiers who have distinguished themselves in other ways. The discipline and precision required for these duties actually complement combat training. They reinforce the attention to detail and mental toughness that serve soldiers well in any environment." As the immediate tension began to dissolve, replaced by something approaching mutual understanding, it became clear that the confrontation was evolving into something neither man had expected. What had started as a political attack on military ceremony was becoming a conversation about grief, service, and the different ways that people honor military sacrifice. The gathered crowd sensed the shift in mood. Atmosphere in the courtyard began to change from confrontational to contemplative. But this was only the beginning of what would prove to be a transformative experience for everyone involved, particularly for a senator who was about to learn that his assumptions about military service were not just wrong, but harmful to his own process of grieving his nephew's sacrifice. The conversation that followed in the palace courtyard was unlike anything anyone present had ever witnessed during a diplomatic visit. What had begun as a hostile confrontation between an American senator and a British guard had evolved into something approaching a therapeutic dialogue about military service and the different ways people process grief and honor sacrifice. Senator Vance stood quietly for several minutes, clearly struggling with the collision between his preconceptions and the reality of the men standing before him. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier aggression. "Jacob used to write to me about the British soldiers he worked with," he said slowly. "He said they were some of the most professional and dedicated troops he had ever encountered." He mentioned working with Grenadier Guards on several operations. Edward's expression softened with recognition. "Senator, it's entirely possible that our paths crossed during my deployment. American and British forces worked closely together throughout Helmand Province. The Marines were particularly effective partners, disciplined, brave, and completely committed to the mission." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your nephew was part of something that mattered deeply to all of us who served there." The senator's composure finally broke completely. Years of suppressed grief, anger, and confusion about his nephews. Death came pouring out in a rush of emotion that surprised everyone, including himself. "I've been so angry," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Angry at the military for taking him, angry at politicians for sending him, angry at ceremonies and traditions that seemed to glorify something that cost me my nephew. I didn't understand that the people in these ceremonies were the same people who served alongside him." Ambassador Thornton, recognizing that this had moved far beyond diplomatic protocol into deeply personal territory, made a decision that would later be praised by her superiors. Instead of trying to rush the group inside to avoid further public exposure, she allowed the conversation to continue, understanding instinctively that something important was happening that needed to reach its natural conclusion. Sergeant Collins, whose experience with grieving families during his years of service had taught him how to navigate these delicate conversations, stepped closer to the senator. "Sir, if I may ask, did your nephew ever write to you about the ceremonies and traditions his unit observed? Military honors, memorial services, flag ceremonies?" Nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "He wrote about a memorial service they held for a Marine who was killed in his first week in country. Jacob said it was the most meaningful thing he had ever been part of. He described how they folded the flag, how they played taps, how every Marine in the unit stood at attention for hours to honor their fallen brother." "That's exactly what we do here," Collins explained gently. "These ceremonial duties aren't separate from combat service, they're how we continue to serve after we return home. Every time we stand guard, every time we perform these traditions, we're honoring the memory of soldiers like your nephew who didn't make it back." The truth of this connection seemed to hit Senator Vance like a physical force. "I never understood," he said, shaking his head. "I thought ceremonies were just politics, public relations. I didn't realize they were how you honor the fallen." His voice was thick with emotion, and several people in the gathering had tears in their eyes as they witnessed this moment of genuine realization and pain. Corporal Hughes, despite having been personally insulted by the senator's earlier comments, showed remarkable grace in his response. "Senator, grief can make us angry at things that remind us of our loss. It's natural to want to lash out at anything connected to military service when someone you love doesn't come home. But your nephew served with honor, and these traditions are part of how we make sure that service is never forgotten." Edward made a decision that went beyond military protocol and entered the realm of simple human compassion. "Senator, would you like to hear about the memorial traditions we observe here? How we incorporate the memory of fallen soldiers into our daily duties?" Senator Vance nodded, seeming grateful for the opportunity to learn something that might help him make sense of his nephew's sacrifice. Every morning before we assume our posts, we observe a moment of silence for all the soldiers who have given their lives in service to their countries, Edward explained. It doesn't matter whether they were British, American, or from any of our allied nations. We honor them all because we understand that freedom is something that requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. The senator listened intently, absorbing every word as if it might help heal something that had been broken inside him for years. Today, during that moment of silence, I will specifically remember Marine Jacob Vance of Ohio, who died serving his country in Afghanistan. His sacrifice will be part of what gives meaning to every ceremonial duty I perform. This promise seemed to reach the deepest part of Senator Vance's grief. For the first time since his nephew's death, he felt like someone truly understood the magnitude of what had been lost and the importance of honoring that sacrifice properly. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than any political speech he had ever delivered. The British officials present exchanged glances that conveyed both relief and admiration for how Edward had handled an impossible situation. Ambassador Thornton made a mental note to recommend Edward for commendation, understanding that she had just witnessed military diplomacy at its finest. The American staff members looked at their principal with new respect, seeing him show vulnerability and growth that was rare in political contexts. As the immediate emotional intensity began to settle, Senator Vance looked around at the guards in the gathering with obvious embarrassment about his earlier behavior. "Gentlemen, I owe you an apology. A profound apology. I came here with assumptions and prejudices that were completely unfounded, and I attacked your service based on ignorance rather than understanding." Edward's response demonstrated the magnanimity that comes from true confidence and security. "No apology necessary, sir. Grief affects us all differently, and protecting the memory of those we've lost is something every soldier understands. Nephew's service deserves to be honored, and if our conversation today helps you find a way to do that, then something good has come from this difficult moment." The senator nodded gratefully, beginning to understand that he had encountered something rare in his political career: genuine forgiveness, coupled with an opportunity to learn and grow from his mistakes. But the conversation was far from over, and the full impact of this encounter was yet to be revealed. 6 months after the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, Senator J.D. Vance stood before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee with a very different perspective on military service and ceremonial traditions. The committee was reviewing funding for various military programs, including honor guard units and ceremonial functions that some lawmakers had been questioning as unnecessary expenses during tight budget times. "Mr. Chairman," Senator Vance began, his voice carrying a gravity that surprised his colleagues, "I rise today to speak about the vital importance of military ceremonial duties and the exceptional soldiers who perform them." The statement was so different from his previous positions on military spending that several committee members looked up from their notes with obvious surprise. 6 months ago, I had the privilege of meeting some of the most distinguished combat veterans I have ever encountered, Senator Vance continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. They happened to be serving in ceremonial roles at the time, and I made the mistake of assuming that ceremonial duty somehow diminished their service record or their dedication to our shared military values. I was profoundly wrong. In his office, in London, Captain Edward Harrington was watching the Senate hearing on his laptop. Having been alerted to Senator Vance's planned remarks by Ambassador Thornton, the months since their encounter had been professionally rewarding for Edward, who had received commendations for his handling of the diplomatic incident and had been selected for promotion to major. But more importantly, he had received dozens of letters from American veterans and military families who had heard about his dignified response to Senator Vance's initial attack. "The young British officer who educated me that day," Senator Vance was saying to the committee, "served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, earned a Bronze Star for valor, and was wounded in action while protecting his men during a 6-hour firefight. Yet some of my colleagues here would have us believe that his current assignment to ceremonial duties makes him less of a soldier. This thinking is not only wrong, it's dangerous." Senator Vance had spent the months since the palace incident conducting his own research into military ceremonial programs, both American and international. He had visited Arlington National Cemetery, observed the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and spoken with dozens of honor guard members about their service records. What he discovered had fundamentally changed his understanding of how military traditions connect to combat readiness and veteran affairs. Every member of the old guard at Arlington, he continued, is an active-duty soldier who has met the highest standards of military excellence. The same is true for our Navy ceremonial units, our Air Force honor guards, and our Marine Corps ceremonial detachments. These are not actors or performers. They are warriors who have earned the privilege of representing our military's finest traditions. Edward smiled as he watched the senator's passionate defense of ceremonial military service, remembering the angry man who had confronted him in the palace courtyard. The transformation had been gradual but genuine, beginning with their extended conversation after the initial confrontation and continuing through months of correspondence and research that had educated the senator about military culture and traditions. In the weeks following their meeting, Senator Vance had written to Edward, asking for recommendations about military history books and requesting information about British military traditions. Edward had responded thoughtfully, sharing resources and connecting the senator with other veterans who could provide different perspectives on military service. The relationship had evolved from confrontational to educational to genuinely respectful. Have learned, Senator Vance told the committee, that ceremonial military service requires many of the same qualities that make soldiers effective in combat: discipline, attention to detail, physical fitness, mental toughness, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. More importantly, these ceremonies serve a vital function in maintaining the military culture that produces effective combat soldiers. The senator's remarks were having a visible impact on his colleagues, several of whom had been preparing to support cuts to ceremonial programs. Committee Chairman Senator Roberts, a Vietnam veteran himself, was nodding appreciatively as Vance made his case. The transformation of one of the military's harshest critics into an articulate defender of military traditions was remarkable to witness. Furthermore, Senator Vance continued, I have come to understand that these ceremonial duties serve our veterans and military families in ways that combat training alone cannot. When we honor military traditions publicly, we are telling every family that has sacrificed for military service that their loved one's contribution matters and will be remembered with dignity and respect. Edward thought about his own family back in Manchester, how proud his parents had been when he was selected for the Queen's Guard, and how that pride had helped them process the anxiety they had felt during his combat deployments. The senator was beginning to understand something that Edward had always known. Ceremony and combat service weren't opposite ends of a spectrum, but complementary aspects of a complete military culture. The hearing continued for another hour, with Senator Vance fielding questions from colleagues who were curious about his changed position on military spending and ceremonial programs. His answers were detailed and passionate, demonstrating that his conversion had been based on genuine research and reflection rather than political calculation. After the hearing ended, Senator Vance returned to his office and immediately began drafting a letter to Edward. As had become their custom, their correspondence had evolved into a meaningful friendship that bridged national boundaries and political differences. Founded on mutual respect for military service and shared concern for veterans' welfare. Captain Harrington, he wrote, I watched your promotion ceremony online last week, and I was struck by how proud I felt watching someone I now consider a friend receive the recognition he deserves. Your patient education of an ignorant American politician has had effects you couldn't have imagined. Today I was able to protect funding for honor guard programs across all service branches, and I did it by sharing the lessons you taught me about the connection between ceremonial service and combat excellence. The letter continued, I want you to know that every time I see an honor guard now at Arlington, at military funerals, at change of command ceremonies, I think about Jacob and about you. And I understand that I'm witnessing not just tradition, but active service to something larger than any individual. You helped me transform my grief into respect and my anger into advocacy. Edward read the letter in his quarters that evening, still amazed by the journey that had brought them from confrontation to friendship. The incident had taught him as much as it had taught the senator, demonstrating that even the most hostile encounters could become opportunities for education and growth when approached with patience and integrity. The story of their confrontation and subsequent friendship had become something of a legend within both British and American military circles, used as an example of how military professionalism could overcome political divisiveness and personal pain. Training programs now included case studies of the incident, teaching young officers how to handle hostile encounters with dignity. While standing firm in defense of military values, years later, when Senator Vance visited Britain again, this time as part of a formal Veterans Affairs delegation, he made a special request to meet with Edward, now Major Harrington, and his fellow guards. The reunion was warm and respectful, between men who had learned that their shared commitment to honoring military service was more important than their initial disagreements, standing once again in the palace courtyard where it all began. Senator Vance looked at the guards with genuine admiration. "You know," he said, "Jacob would have been proud to serve alongside soldiers like you, and I'm proud to call you friends." The words represented a complete transformation from the angry man who had once questioned their right to wear their legacy of that confrontation continued to influence military and political relationships for years to come, proving that even the most difficult encounters could become catalysts for understanding and positive change when met with patience, truth, and genuine commitment to something larger than personal pride.